Imagine, if you will, living in a country where just over a decade ago, stepping outside your front door felt like, well, a literal gamble with your life. You're in a place that back in 2015 recorded a staggering 106.3 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants.
Which is just an unbelievable number.
Right. At the time, that was the highest murder rate in the entire Western Hemisphere. We're talking about a nation completely held hostage by invisible borders, where simply crossing a street into the wrong neighborhood could be a fatal mistake just because you unknowingly stepped from one gang's territory into another.
Yeah, you didn't even have to be involved. You just took the wrong bus route.
Exactly. Now, fast forward to 2024. That same number, that terrifying 106.3, plummeted to 1.9.
Yeah. It's a statistical freefall. The criminologists and sociologists usually argue is mechanically impossible in such a condensed time frame. I mean, a drop of that magnitude generally requires generations of systemic socioeconomic reform, not just, a few years of policy shifts.
Which brings us to an incredibly uncomfortable question. And it's the central thread I really want you, the listener, to hold on to as we navigate the incredible complexities we have lined up for you today. What would you be willing to trade for that kind of peace?
That is the million-dollar question.
If the absolute physical safety of your family was guaranteed, what constitutional rights, what foundational democratic norms would you be willing to sacrifice? So today, we're answering that question by looking at the ultimate modern political paradox. And we're drawing entirely from a phenomenal, comprehensive dossier created by Juan Carlos Navarrete for his podcast, Crónicas al Sur del Rio Grande.
It's an incredible piece of research.
Oh, it's meticulous. Navarrete's research spans political biographies, human rights reports, and hard economic data all the way up through May 2026. And it serves as our definitive roadmap today. We are going deep into the rise of Nayib Bukele, the self-proclaimed architect of the new El Salvador. The mission here is to figure out, how did a 37-year-old millennial publicist dismantle a 30-year bipartisan political system, pacify an entire nation, and concurrently erode its democratic foundations? Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, the structural tension at the core of Bukele's entire national project, it requires us to look at two completely incompatible realities that are somehow existing simultaneously.
Okay, how so?
So on one hand, you have security, right? The undeniable, tangible removal of gang violence from the daily lives of millions of people. And then on the other hand, you have democracy, the checks and balances, the Constitution, the freedom of the press.
Right, the stuff that usually holds a country together.
Exactly. But what the Navarrete dossier illustrates so clearly is that in Bukele's El Salvador, these two concepts do not coexist in harmony. One is actively and deliberately consuming the other.
Wow. So to understand how he engineered a system where security eats democracy, we actually have to go way back. Because you don't just, wake up one day and decide to completely rewrite the rules of a nation unless you have a very specific view of the world.
And a very specific relationship with authority.
Right. The dossier takes us back long before his birth in 1981, actually starting in the early 20th century, over on the hillsides of Bethlehem and Jerusalem.
Yeah, his great-grandparents emigrated from the fading Ottoman Empire to El Salvador as part of a significant wave of Palestinian migration to Latin America.
Which is super important context.
It is vital because those immigrants arrived as merchants. They didn't have the vast tracts of land that the established Salvadoran elites possessed,
Yeah.
So they built their wealth through commerce and industry instead.
Which brings us to the gravitational center of Bukele's early life, which is his father, Armando Bukele Catan. The dossier paints a picture of a man who was, an absolute polymath.
Oh, without a doubt. He wasn't just a businessman. He was an industrial chemist, a highly successful entrepreneur. He authored physics books.
Physics books, that's wild.
Yeah, but his most massive influence on El Salvador was actually spiritual and intellectual. Armando converted to Islam in the 1980s. He became a prominent Muslim leader and founded 5 mosques, including literally the very first mosque in El Salvador, which was built in 1992.
Which creates this really fascinating household dynamic for Nayib, because you have a deeply intellectual Muslim convert father and a Catholic mother, Olga Ortez, who came from a rural town called Concepcion de Oriente.
And that profound religious duality, it heavily marked Nayib's upbringing. Today, Bukele publicly identifies as Christian, but because of his father, he possesses this highly syncretic spiritual vocabulary.
Right, he understands the architecture of faith. He knows how to speak to it.
Exactly. But more importantly, for our political analysis, we really have to look at how his father communicated. Armando was an autodidact who hosted a television show called Aclarando Conceptos.
Clarifying concepts.
Right.
So Armando is sitting there on local television, breaking down the national situation, directly analyzing politics and society for the Salvadoran public. He is essentially doing a proto-podcast broadcast directly to the masses.
What's fascinating here is that Armando provided the absolute, undeniable blueprint for Bukele's later political communication strategy. The father used his TV show to bypass the traditional media gatekeepers, the major newspapers and establishment channels that usually dictated the national conversation.
He spoke directly to the public.
He did. And decades later, Nayib simply took that exact philosophy of direct, unfiltered communication and upgraded the technology. He just swapped the local television studio for a smartphone and a Twitter account.
He optimized his dad's playbook for the 21st century. That's so smart. But there's another psychological layer to his youth that I think is, well, it's the engine behind his entire political drive.
The outsider complex.
Exactly. Nayib grew up wealthy. He attended an exclusive bilingual private school. He was surrounded by his brothers, Karim, Youssef, and Ibrahim, who are like his closest confidants and businessmen today. But despite all that money, the Bukele family was never truly accepted by the traditional Criollo elite.
Right, and for context, the Criollo elite is a term referring to the historical closed-circle families, often called the 14 families in Salvadoran lore, that have traditionally dominated the agro-export economy.
Specifically coffee.
Specifically coffee, and by extension, the entire political system. But because the Bukeles were of Palestinian descent and built their wealth in newer commercial sectors rather than ancestral land holdings, they were viewed as new money. They are perpetual outsiders to this entrenched upper class.
Imagine the resentment that breeds, You have the capital, you have the education, but you are still locked out of the country club. He's an outsider looking in, and he clearly decided not to waste time trying to appease them.
Yeah, he takes a totally different route.
Right. At just 18 years old, he drops out of law school at the prestigious UCA University, which is a highly symbolic rejection of traditional professional credentialing just to run the family businesses.
Yeah, he takes over a Yamaha motorcycle dealership and becomes the president of an advertising agency called Oberman.
This is the pivot point right here. He is not trained in the traditional pipelines of Salvadoran power. He isn't a lawyer parsing constitutional text. He isn't a political scientist theorizing about statecraft. And he isn't an economist.
He is fundamentally trained in marketing.
Yes.
He's trained in public relations, in crisis management, and in selling a narrative brand.
Which makes perfect sense when you look at how he later targets the political establishment. I mean, he didn't approach the traditional political parties, the FMLN on the left and Arena on the right, as ideological enemies. He looked at them like a disruptive tech founder looks at a legacy industry.
Like Blockbuster and Netflix.
Exactly. He saw two bloated, arrogant monopolies that were utterly failing to deliver a working product to the consumer. But it forces us to ask, how much of his later political brand was a genuine ideological stance and how much was just an incredibly honed, inherited advertising acumen?
Well, the evidence suggests the ideology is completely secondary to the marketing strategy. To understand this, I would ask you, the listener, to think about how your own family's dinner table conversations shaped your worldview.
Right.
If you grew up feeling like an outsider in your own community, excluded by the legacy power brokers, how does that change the way you interact with authority?
Yeah.
For Bukele, that outsider status wasn't a vulnerability. It became his most authentic, powerful, and aggressively wielded political weapon.
And as the Navarrete dossier details, he took that weapon and marched straight into the belly of the beast. The way he actually entered politics in 2012 is almost startlingly casual.
It really is.
According to a story he told on a Facebook Live, he was in a meeting with the communications director of the FMLN. Now let's pause and give some context here. The FMLN, the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, isn't just any political party.
No, they have a massive history.
Right. They were formed by former Marxist guerrillas who fought a brutal 12-year civil war against the U.S.-backed military government. This is a party with deep ideological roots and strict internal discipline. And Bukele, a 30-year-old millionaire marketing executive, just casually asked them if they need a mayoral candidate for a tiny municipality called Nuevo Cuscatlán.
It was a municipality of roughly 8,000 residents. The FMLN didn't really have a strong candidate, so they essentially just let him borrow the party logo.
Which is wild.
Yeah, and Nuevo Cuscatlán immediately became his political laboratory. He ran under the FMLN banner, but from the very first day, His campaign mechanics were completely divorced from Marxist ideology or class struggle.
He treated the town like a failing subsidiary that needed a corporate turnaround. He wins the election in March 2012 and instantly starts implementing what would become his signature brand.
Right, the results-driven approach.
Yeah, he improves access to basic infrastructure, education, health, clean water. But the absolute stroke of PR genius was what he did with his paycheck. He publicly donated his entire mayoral salary to fund university scholarships for local youth.
It established a brand of absolute, unassailable pragmatism. Furthermore, he raised the salaries of the municipal workers, which created immediate local loyalty. He completely bypassed the traditional party hierarchy, prioritizing direct, highly publicized communication with the citizens over party discipline.
And the results were so undeniable that by 2015, the FMLN leadership realized they had a massive political asset on their hands. They needed to hold the capital city, so they ran him for mayor of San Salvador.
Which is a massive leap in visibility.
Huge. He wins San Salvador and immediately launches a highly visible project to revitalize the historic center of the city. His popularity skyrockets, and this is where the aesthetic truly solidifies. He starts wearing the backward cap, the leather jacket, the designer sneakers.
He's styling himself as the cool millennial disruptor.
Exactly, but you can see the collision coming a mile away. The honeymoon with the old-school Marxist guerrillas is not going to last.
The friction was inevitable. The FMLN operates on strict organic discipline, collective decision-making, and ideological loyalty. Bukele's style was intensely personalistic.
Right, he doesn't want to run things past a committee.
No, he viewed decisions as unilateral executive actions, not matters for a party debate. As he gained popularity, he began openly criticizing the national FMLN leadership, essentially branding them as corrupt as their right-wing rivals.
And by October 2017, the tension snaps. The FMLN's ethics tribunal officially expels him from the party, and the charges they filed against him are incredibly telling about his internal behavior.
They accused him of promoting internal division, making defamatory statements against the leadership, and they cited a specific incident of verbal and physical aggression toward a female municipal official, Xochitl Marchelli.
And they kicked him out with a unanimous vote.
Now, in the traditional paradigm of Salvadoran politics, being expelled by the ruling party is a career death sentence. You lose the funding, the territorial organization, the ballot access.
It's game over.
Usually. But Bukele flipped the narrative. He used the expulsion to validate his core brand. He claimed he was the outsider who was too clean, too effective for the corrupt political machine. So in 2018, he founded his own movement, Nuevas Ideas, or New Ideas.
And this triggers the most chaotic, bizarre, institutional obstacle course to the presidency. Because to run in the 2019 presidential election, he needs a legally registered party. He tries to register Nuevas Ideas, but the electoral tribunal blocks him, citing missed deadlines.
So he pivots.
Right. He allies with a smaller center-left party called Cambio Democrático. But shortly after, the Supreme Electoral Tribunal dissolves that party as well, citing past electoral performance rules.
He was rapidly running out of time. The establishment was actively using the bureaucratic machinery to keep him off the ballot. So, in an ultimate display of ideological fluidity, Bukele makes an 11th-hour deal to run under the banner of Grande, the Grand Alliance for National Unity.
Okay, wait. I really have to push back on this because this is where the narrative of the principled outsider gets incredibly murky to me. Grande is a center-right party.
Yes.
It was literally formed by defectors from Arena, the hardcore right-wing party. So Bukele starts his career carrying the banner of Marxist guerrillas, tries to start his own movement, and when that fails, he just hops into bed with a right-wing party just to get on the ballot.
That's what happened.
And all the while, he claims he doesn't believe in political labels. That feels less like pragmatism and more like sheer unadulterated political opportunism.
Well, that critique is heavily debated by political scientists, and it is a major focus in the Navarrete dossier. Academics at the University of Central America, the UCA, categorize his ideology as right-wing populism.
Okay.
They point out that despite his claims of being post-ideological, his methods heavily rely on pitting a supposedly homogeneous, virtuous people against a corrupt, entrenched elite. Other analysts draw parallels to a wide spectrum of populist leaders globally, from Javier Milei in Argentina to Donald Trump in the U.S., and even authoritarian figures like Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua or Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines.
But the voters didn't care.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Bukele's party hopping revealed a profound tectonic shift in Salvadoran society. The post-Civil War bipartisan system was effectively dead. The FMLN and Arena had dominated politics for 30 years. For 3 decades, the public watched both parties trade the presidency while corruption scandals piled up and the gangs functionally controlled the streets. The electorate was deeply traumatized and exhausted. Bukele proved that the Salvadoran voter no longer cared about the ideological purity of a Marxist versus a capitalist.
I think about it like brand loyalty for a utility. If your power company keeps shutting off the electricity and a new company comes along promising to keep the lights on, do you really care what the CEO's political philosophy is?
No, you just want the lights to work.
Exactly. Salvadorans viewed Bukele's party hopping through that exact lens. They didn't care that the Gone All logo was next to his name. They were voting for the guy who fixed the water in Nuevo Cuscatlan and revitalized the plazas in San Salvador.
And that desperate desire for a functional state propelled him to a historic victory. On February 3 in 2019, Nayib Bukele won the presidency in the first round with 53.1% of the vote. He completely bypassed the need for a runoff.
That is massive.
He became the youngest president in Salvadoran history and the first to shatter the FMLN Arena duopoly since the peace accords were signed in 1992.
But winning the election is just the acquisition phase. Now he actually has to govern. And remember, he doesn't have a massive, deeply rooted party structure backing him in the legislature yet. Gana was just a rental car to get to the presidential palace.
That's a good way to put it.
To maintain his grip on power and keep the public engaged, he had to invent an entirely new, highly centralized way of governing.
This is where the marketing executive completely takes over the apparatus of the state. The Neverett dossier extensively documents how Bukele fundamentally altered the relationship between the presidency, the press, and the public through aggressive digital communication.
We have to talk about September 2019. He has only been president for 3 months. He travels to New York for the United Nations General Assembly.
This is an iconic moment.
Oh, totally. He walks up to the iconic green marble podium, looks out at the assembly hall full of diplomats, heads of state, translators, and before he utters a single word of his speech, he pulls out his smartphone, an iPhone 11, which had literally just been released, holds it up, smiles, and takes a selfie.
It was a highly calculated, meticulously designed disruption of global diplomatic norms. He then delivered a speech declaring that the United Nations format was obsolete and that the real world wasn't in that room, it was on the internet.
That single image of the young, cool president taking a selfie at the UN went massively viral across the globe.
It was a brilliant manifesto. He's broadcasting to the world and, more importantly, to his citizens back home that the old rules of decorum, process, and institutions do not apply to him. And he brought that exact energy straight back into the executive branch.
He effectively fired the traditional press conference. Instead, he turned Twitter, now X, into his official presidential dispatch.
The dossier highlights the mechanics of this shift. By governing via X, a tweet from Bukele instantly becomes the headline that the entire national media ecosystem is forced to react to and reproduce.
Right.
He began using the platform to hire officials, publicly fire ministers, and issue direct, real-time orders to the heads of the police and the military.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. It's not just about administrative efficiency. It is about total narrative control. I look at how Bukele handles criticism, and I see a modern social media manager handling a brand crisis.
Oh, absolutely.
When traditional media attacks a normal politician, that politician's office issues a multi-page, legally vetted press release that nobody reads. When the media attacks Bukele, he drops a meme. He replies with a sarcastic gif. He makes his millions of followers feel like they were part of an inside joke, while the investigative journalists are the out-of-touch punchline.
He cultivated a highly insulated, deeply loyal digital ecosystem. The dossier notes his strategic use of influencers, figures like the Mexican influencer Luis Comendes, to amplify his message across borders.
He knows how to play the algorithm.
Completely. He utilizes TikTok trends to connect with the youth demographic, completely bypassing policy debates. Between June 2019 and November 2023, his followers on X grew by more than 900%. Relative to El Salvador's population of roughly 6 million, he possesses one of the most disproportionately massive digital footprints of any political leader globally.
But there is an incredibly dark, systemic underside to this digital circus. Because if your entire power base relies on controlling the narrative, you have to actively silence competing narratives.
Absolutely. The Never Read dossier explicitly details a documented systemic war on the press. because Bukele's strategy relies on unmediated direct communication with the public. Independent journalism, which exists to mediate, fact-check, and provide context, becomes an existential threat to his brand.
The numbers are chilling. The research shows that by June 2025, 40 journalists were forced into exile. And to be clear, they weren't fleeing the country because of mean tweets or online trolling.
No.
They were facing state-level harassment, severe judicialization, which means the government was weaponizing the legal system to hit them with bogus charges and digital espionage.
The espionage aspect requires a deeper explanation, as it reveals the sophisticated nature of the state's reach. International organizations confirmed the use of Pegasus spyware against Salvadoran journalists.
Which is terrifying.
It really is.
Yeah.
Most notably, they targeted reporters from El Faro, which is widely considered one of the most respected investigative outlets in all of Latin America. For the listener who might not be familiar, Pegasus is military-grade cyber intelligence software developed in Israel.
And it uses what are called zero-click exploits.
Exactly.
Huh.
This means a journalist doesn't even have to click a malicious link or download an attachment. The software infects the phone silently, granting the operator total access to encrypted messages, emails, photos, and even the ability to remotely activate the phone's microphone and camera.
The psychological terror of that is immense. Imagine trying to run a confidential source when you know the government might be listening through your phone at any given second. It completely strangles investigative reporting.
That's the goal.
But Bukele masks this aggressive, authoritarian pressure with a highly potent narrative tool that ties right back to his childhood. The dossier points out his strategic, consistent use of religious, specifically Pentecostal language.
El Salvador is a profoundly religious country. Bukele taps into that deep cultural vein by framing his presidency not merely as a political mandate won at the ballot box, but as a providential mission ordained by God.
Wow.
He frequently cites biblical scripture during critical moments of national tension, and he conspicuously surrounds himself with evangelical pastors.
He casts his entire administration as a divine intervention against the chaos and bloodshed of the past. By merging this highly entertaining, meme-filled digital bubble with the language of divine right, he perfectly isolates his critics.
Right, because it changes the stakes entirely.
If you, as a journalist or an opposition politician, criticize his policies, you aren't just a political opponent, you are branded an enemy of the people, and implicitly an enemy of God's plan for El Salvador. The spiritual rhetoric adds an undeniable layer of moral absolute to his digital decrees.
It creates a closed loop of information where the leader is infallible and the critics are inherently malicious.
Think about your own media consumption for a second. If a politician you genuinely admired stopped answering questions from reporters and instead just announced major life-altering policies via casual, heavily edited TikTok videos, would you feel more connected to them because it feels modern and authentic? Or would you be deeply concerned about the complete lack of transparency and pushback?
That is the exact cognitive dissonance his communication style relies upon. But while the digital aesthetic and the memes kept his popularity exceptionally high, the reality of El Salvador demanded far more than a sophisticated PR strategy.
The real world always catches up.
Always. The true test of his presidency and the inescapable core of his legacy lay in the physical streets of the country.
Right. Let's pivot to the very real, very bloody crisis that had defined El Salvador for decades, the gangs. The war that Bukele waged against MS-13 and Barrio 18 is the centerpiece of this entire story. This is the Faustian bargain.
In June 2019, merely 3 weeks after taking the oath of office, Bukele launched the Plan Control Territorial, the Territorial Control Plan. The public phase of this plan involved deploying thousands of heavily armed police and military soldiers directly into gang strongholds.
And initially, the homicide rate did begin to drop.
It did. But the dossier reveals that the drop wasn't just the result of having more boots on the ground. This is where the vital investigative journalism of El Faro comes in, the exact same outlet that was later targeted with that Pegasus spyware.
What did they find when they dug into the falling murder rates?
They published an explosive revelation, backed by hundreds of leaked internal penitentiary reports and logbooks. They revealed that in parallel to this massive public show of force, Bukele's government was secretly negotiating with the leadership of Mara Salvatrucha, the MS-13.
Secret negotiations with the very terrorists the military was supposed to be fighting. We need to understand the mechanics of this. How does a government negotiate with a decentralized criminal organization that relies on extortion and murder?
Well, the gangs in El Salvador operate with a strict hierarchy, but the top leadership, often referred to as the Ranfla, is largely incarcerated. The reports indicated that government officials were entering the maximum security prisons to hold meetings with these leaders.
So they're going straight to the top.
Yes. They were trading prison benefits like better living conditions, access to cell phones, and privileges in exchange for the gang leaders sending orders out to the streets to lower the murder rate. The U.S. State Department eventually issued formal accusations corroborating that the Salvadoran government was engaging in these negotiations.
A charge which Bukele has vehemently and consistently denied. Which makes me stop and wonder, if he was actively negotiating with MS-13 in secret to keep the numbers down, did his famous tough-on-crime stance only happen because the deal fell apart? It really challenges the narrative of the uncompromising sheriff that he portrays to the world. If you were making deals with the devil to keep the peace, you aren't defeating the devil, you are just renting his behavior.
That is precisely the mechanism analysts suggest triggered the ultimate crackdown. The gangs hold the leverage in a truce because they control the dial on the violence, and the turning point was brutal, sudden, and devastating.
March 2022.
On the weekend of March 25, 2022, the fragile alleged peace utterly shattered. In a single weekend, 87 people were murdered across the country. The government and external analysts framed it as a violent reaction from the gangs, essentially a massive show of force to demand better terms, or a bloody protest against the breakdown of the secret pact.
87 murders in a weekend. The panic in the streets must have been unimaginable. And Bukele's response wasn't to renegotiate. His response was immediate, overwhelming, and legally absolute.
On March 27th, the Legislative Assembly, which by this point was fully controlled by his party, Nuevas Ideas, possessing a supermajority, approved the Régimen d'Exception, the state of exception.
We need to be very clear about the legal mechanics of what a state of exception actually means. It's not just a strict curfew or putting more cops on the corner. It is the formal legal suspension of fundamental constitutional rights.
Exactly.
The right to a lawyer when you were arrested, suspended. The right to be informed of the reasons for your detention, suspended. The constitutional limit on how long the state can hold you without formally charging you with a crime, gone. It extended the administrative detention period from 72 hours to 15 days, and eventually longer.
It provided the security forces with an absolute blank check, and the regime of exception, originally passed as a 30-day emergency measure, was renewed month after month, becoming the permanent motor of his war against the gangs.
And the results were insane.
The results on the security front were, by every statistical metric, spectacular. Let's look at the hard numbers from the dossier. In 2015, the homicide rate was 106.3 per 100,000. By 2019, his first year, it was down to 38. By 2022, the year the state of exception started, it dropped to 7.8. And by 2024, it hit 1.9.
Entire neighborhoods that had been completely choked by MS-13 and Barrio 18 extortion, places where a small bakery had to pay half its revenue just to stay open, places where you couldn't cross the street to visit your grandmother without paying a toll to a teenager with a gun, were suddenly liberated.
Overnight.
The BBC reported that communities historically terrorized by gangs were finally experiencing profound peace. People could sit on their porches at night without fear of stray bullets. Kids could play outside in parks that used to be execution grounds. It is an undeniable, miraculous success for the daily lives of those citizens.
It is a profound societal relief. But to analyze this impartially, as the dossier demands, we must look at the staggering human costs required to achieve that statistical miracle. The state of exception resulted in over 85,000 people being detained by security forces.
85,000 people. In a country of roughly 6 million, that is a massive percentage of the young male population simply vanished into the prison system.
And because the constitutional right to due process was suspended, the dragnet was incredibly dangerously wide. Police were given arrest quotas.
Quotas, that's a recipe for disaster.
Completely. People were detained for having suspicious tattoos, for living in the wrong neighborhood, or simply based on an anonymous tip. Bukele himself publicly admitted that roughly 8,000 innocent people were swept up in the dragnet, jailed, and eventually released.
But the real number is probably higher, right?
Human rights NGOs like Socorro Juridico Humanitario track the data differently and estimate the number of innocents is vastly higher, potentially up to 25,000 people arbitrarily detained.
You were talking about tens of thousands of people pulled out of their homes in the middle of the night with no right to call a lawyer, held in severely overcrowded, brutal prisons for months or years without seeing a judge.
The conditions are horrific.
And the conditions in those prisons, I mean, the dossier documents 374 deaths in state custody during this period. And tragically, horribly, that number includes 25 women and 4 infants who fell ill inside the prisons.
The sheer scale of the incarcerations and the lack of judicial oversight led to massive international condemnation. By March 2026, a comprehensive report by international jurists formally accused the Bukele government of committing crimes against humanity during the implementation of the state of exception, citing systematic torture, arbitrary detention, and forced disappearances.
And to warehouse all these people, the state built a monument to this exact policy, the CECOT.
The Terrorism Confinement Center. Inaugurated in March 2023, it is a sprawling mega-prison with a stated capacity for 40,000 inmates. It cost $115 million to build and is equipped with state-of-the-art surveillance and heavily armed guards.
The visual imagery of CECOT is burned into the global consciousness. It looks like something out of a dystopian film. You see thousands of men, their heads completely shaved, stripped down to identical white shorts, running barefoot in tight formations, sitting on the concrete floor with their hands locked behind their heads.
It's pure shock and awe.
For Bukele's fervent supporters, those meticulously produced videos are the ultimate proof that justice is finally being served to the monsters who destroyed their country. For human rights advocates, it's a terrifying postcard of unchecked authoritarianism.
What is truly remarkable is how CECOT has become a bizarre international political attraction. The dossier highlights that leaders from around the world have traveled to El Salvador specifically to tour the facility and study the hardline model.
Really? Like who?
For instance, Chile's conservative leader José Antonio Cast visited in 2026. The dossier even notes an incredible geopolitical development, where in 2025 the Trump administration utilized CECOT to house Venezuelan migrants under a bilateral agreement, adding a whole new international utility to the facility.
And then, in 2026, the state held a historic, massive collective trial against the entire MS-13 leadership inside the walls of CECOT. Its judicial theater, its raw justice, its state vengeance, all wrapped into one highly publicized event.
This raises an important question, perhaps the foundational question of the entire Navarrete dossier. Can a functioning democracy actually survive when its core constitutional rights are permanently suspended in order to maintain basic physical safety?
That's the paradox.
We are forced to look at two realities existing simultaneously. A BBC Mundo reality, where terrorized communities finally have peace and economic mobility, and a Human Rights Watch reality, where thousands of innocent lives are destroyed by an opaque, ruthless, and unaccountable justice system.
I want to challenge you, the listener, right now. Put yourself in the shoes of a Salvadoran citizen. If your neighborhood was ruled by violent extortionist gangs for 30 years, if you couldn't start a business, if you feared your son would be recruited or your daughter assaulted every single day, and one man came along and removed those gangs completely, but he told you the price was that your innocent neighbor might get swept up in a police dragnet with no trial, would you take the deal?
The data is unequivocal. For the vast majority of Salvadorans, the answer to that terrible equation was a resounding, enthusiastic yes.
But while the entire world was staring at the mega prison and debating the ethics of the gang war, Bukele was executing a quiet, parallel revolution in the economy and the courts. He used the massive political capital generated by the security victory to push through some truly wild gambles.
The most famous of which is undoubtedly Bitcoin. In September 2021, Bukele made a unilateral executive push to make El Salvador the first country in the world to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender, alongside the US dollar, which has been the official currency since 2001.
It was a massive shock to the global financial system. When he announced it, traditional economists thought he was completely out of his mind. The IMF panicked, rating agencies downgraded the country's debt, and experts warned of total macroeconomic collapse. But let's look at the hard data up to May 2026.
The financial gamble actually paid off for the state balance sheet. By May 2026, El Salvador had accumulated 6,240 bitcoins through state purchases and mining via geothermal volcanic energy.
Wait, volcanic energy? That's crazy.
Yeah, they use the volcanoes to mine crypto. With a massive surge in global crypto prices, that holding translated to a $740.7 million reserve, netting the government a $443 million profit on their initial investment. That represents a 137.7% return.
He literally traded the country's treasury on the crypto market and won big. It is an insane flex. But here is the massive catch. The citizens on the ground are not using it.
Not at all.
The data shows that in 2024, a mere 8% of Salvadorans used Bitcoin for daily transactions. The state built a digital wallet app called Chivo, gave everyone a $30 sign-up bonus, and most people just spent the $30 and deleted the app. It became a state-level wealth mechanism, not a grassroots economic revolution.
And the adoption of a highly volatile cryptocurrency caused severe, protracted friction with traditional international lenders. It took 4 years of incredibly tense negotiations, but in December 2024, El Salvador finally secured a crucial $1.4 billion deal with the International Monetary Fund.
But there were conditions.
Exactly. We have to understand the mechanics of this deal. The IMF only agreed to extend the credit after Bukele made significant concessions, specifically agreeing to make Bitcoin acceptance voluntary rather than legally mandatory for the private sector.
So he makes a killing in crypto, and he completely pacifies the streets. But to execute these massive unilateral moves without being bogged down by congressional debates or judicial injunctions, he needed absolute, unchecked power. And the timeline of how he methodically dismantled the democratic checks and balances is breathtaking.
It began aggressively, utilizing raw intimidation. In February 2020, before his party had secured a majority in the legislature, he wanted approval for a $109 million international loan to fund his security plan. The assembly, which was still controlled by the opposition FMLN and Arena parties, balked at the terms.
So what did he do?
On February 9, Bukele marched into the Legislative Assembly, accompanied by heavily armed military personnel and police in full tactical gear. He literally sat in the chair of the Assembly's president, called the opposing lawmakers criminals, covered his face, and prayed.
He brought the military with assault rifles into the sacred chamber of democracy to force a vote. It's an iconic, terrifying image that signaled the end of the post-war consensus.
Fast forward to May 1, 2021. His party, Nuevas Ideas, officially takes their seats after a landslide electoral victory, giving them an absolute supermajority. In their very first session, on their very first day, they utilize a procedural mechanism claiming loss of constitutional mandate to fire all 5 magistrates of the Constitutional Chamber of the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land.
Just fired them.
And they also fire the Attorney General. They immediately replace them with party loyalists.
And we have to explain why he needed his own judges. The Salvadoran Constitution was written specifically to prevent another dictatorship. In at least 6 different articles, it explicitly forbids consecutive presidential re-election. Article 154 literally says a president cannot continue in their functions not even one more day. It is ironclad.
But in September 2021, the very judges Bukele's party had installed just months prior issued a highly controversial ruling. They reinterpreted the Constitution, claiming that if the president took a leave of absence 6 months before the end of his term, he could legally run for immediate re-election.
It is a legal loophole invented out of thin air, and it paved the way for February 4, 2024. Bukele runs again, and he wins with somewhere between 82 and 85% of the popular vote. His party takes 58 out of 60 seats in the downsized assembly. The political opposition isn't just defeated, it is mathematically vaporized.
And with total institutional control, the pace of reform accelerates. In 2026, the Assembly passed a sweeping constitutional reform allowing life imprisonment for murderers and terrorists.
And how fast did they pass it?
The terrifying part regarding democratic process is that they passed it in just over an hour, with 0 public debate or committee review. It was widely seen as a swift, populist response to the international accusations of crimes against humanity that had dropped just days prior.
So what does this all mean for the structure of the country? I look at this entire situation and I compare it to a house undergoing extreme aggressive renovations.
Okay, let's hear it.
The contractor, Bukele, comes in. He fixes the violently leaky roof, which represents the gang security crisis that was drowning the family. He makes a killing in the stock market with Bitcoin to fund the state's bank account. But while you, the homeowner, were busy admiring the dry living room, he also knocked down all the load-bearing walls, the Constitution, the independent courts, the free press.
The structural integrity.
Yes. And now the roof isn't leaking, but the entire house is structurally dependent on him alone. Oh, and despite the fancy new roof, he locked the homeowners out of the kitchen.
That metaphor perfectly encapsulates the underlying economic reality. Because while the Bitcoin wallet glows green with hundreds of millions in profit and the state secures massive IMF loans, the average citizen's reality is sharply diverging.
The poverty numbers are bad.
Very bad. The dossier notes that extreme poverty rose from 26.8% in 2019 to 30.3% by 2023. 8 out of 10 Salvadorans report cutting back on food consumption because their stagnant incomes simply cannot cover the rising cost of the basic monthly basket of goods. The state is engaging in what economists call over-indebtedness to fund the massive security apparatus and the mega-prisons, while structural poverty continues to grow unchecked.
It's a massive, jarring disconnect. It forces us to ask, how do you measure economic success? Is a country wealthy because its national reserves skyrocket due to a volatile crypto bet? Or is the country poor because its citizens are literally eating less food than they were 5 years ago?
The financial gamble and the political gamble mirror each other perfectly, both relying entirely on high-risk, unilateral decisions made possible only by the complete removal of institutional pushback. There is no one left to tell the president no.
Bringing it all together, we have to look at how the public reacts to this incredibly complex web. You have undeniable, life-altering physical safety, high-stakes financial gambling, rising structural poverty, and the total systematic erosion of democratic institutions. Given all of that, what is the verdict from the Salvadoran people?
The verdict is overwhelming, unprecedented approval. Despite the international human rights criticism, despite the rising poverty and food insecurity, Bukele remains the most popular president in Latin America and consistently ranks as one of the most approved leaders in the entire world.
The polling numbers from 2025 and 2026 are just insane. CID Gallup had him at 85% approval in May 2025 and climbing to 91.9% by the end of that year. The UCA University, which is highly critical of his democratic erosion, still gave his management an 8.39 out of 10. He consistently polls above 80%. How do we explain this enigma? How can a population suffering from rising poverty approve of the government so universally?
The dossier cites deep analysis from academics and exiled journalists speaking to international outlets like DW. They suggest that Salvadoran society now operates within highly disparate information bubbles created by the state's digital dominance. But the core consensus cuts through the propaganda. 66% of the population recognizes the fight against crime as his absolute main achievement. Furthermore, 54% summarize him simply as a president who establishes order with a firm hand. The safety outweighs the poverty.
But there's a darker statistic buried in that polling data, too. 48.3% of the population believes that openly criticizing the president can have serious consequences, with prison being the most frequently mentioned fear. So yes, there is massive, genuine popularity, but it is deeply intertwined with an undercurrent of palpable fear.
And this leads to the ultimate paradox outlined by the UCA researchers. 9 out of 10 Salvadorans state in polls that they believe in democracy and believe it is fundamental to respect the Constitution. Yet those same citizens overwhelmingly support and vote for a leader who has systematically, visibly dismantled those exact institutions.
Because decades of unlivable, violent gang terror simply outweighed abstract liberal principles. If you are bleeding to death from a severed artery, you don't stop to ask the doctor if his medical license is up to date or if he followed hospital protocol. You just want him to stop the bleeding by any means necessary.
Navarrete's dossier on the new El Salvador leaves us with a profound, almost tragic case study of 21st century politics. It frames state effectiveness and liberal democracy not as partners, but as mutually exclusive opposing forces. Bukele proved you can radically transform a traumatized society and rescue it from paralysis, but the price of that rescue was building a regime that completely erodes the rule of law.
We want to profoundly thank Juan Carlos Navarrete for this incredible, exhaustive research from his podcast, Crónicas al Sur del Rio Grande. It has given us so much to unpack and understand about the mechanics of modern power. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final lingering thought. It is something not explicitly detailed in the polling data, but it is absolutely essential to the future of El Salvador.
What is that final piece?
Bukele's entire mandate, his massive popularity, his emergency powers, the continued suspension of constitutional rights through the state of exception, they are all legally and morally justified to the public by the ongoing war against the gangs. But what happens to an authoritarian system when the war is officially won?
That is the perpetual danger of a system built entirely on crisis management.
Exactly. If the gangs are truly gone, if the MS-13 is dismantled and the crisis disappears, does the absolute power disappear with it? Or does a system built on emergency powers always need to invent a new enemy to justify its own survival? Remember that question I asked you at the very beginning? What are you willing to trade for peace? The people of El Salvador made their trade. The murder rate dropped from 106 to 1.9. But the receipt for that transaction is still being written, the total cost hasn't been tallied, and they might be paying for it for generations, something to mull over.